This is Blind Ham News with stories of interest to blind and visually impaired hams. With today's report, here is Steve W0QA.
Welcome to Blind Ham News podcast number 12. This is actually part one of a multi-part feature that we were doing on what is becoming an extremely popular mode of operating in amateur radio, that being FT8. What is FT8? How does it work? And why is it so successful? To help us answer those questions and more, here is Allan KF0FUL.
The beginning of the discussion really is, what is FT8? Because a lot of people really don't know. They hear it a lot, but they don't really understand exactly what it is. And it is a little complicated, actually, when I sat down to kind of write this all out on paper. I mean, I know what it means in my mind, but to try and explain it to someone. So let's start at the beginning. FT8 was introduced in 2017 by Joe Taylor, whose call sign is K1JT, and Steve Franke, his call sign is K9 Alpha November. And these guys have been working on various weak signal type digital modes for many, many years, way before I got into ham radio. Since I've only really been deeply into ham radio again since about 2021. But they've worked on a lot of these things, and I guess they came out with FT8 in the late 2010s. And basically what it is it uses an 8-frequency shift keying digital modulation scheme to basically send a very short message format. And it's not designed for long messages, but short messages. And it's really designed to work in difficult propagation situations. And that's probably, in the beginnings, probably what made it most popular. And there's some other modes that they had come up with. I think one of them was JT65, which was a really good mode. But the FT8 came out, and it can decode a signal-to-noise ratio. Well, the text that I read says as low as minus 20 dB, but I've actually read some other things, and my personal experience is that it can decode signal-to-noise ratios of like minus 24 dB, which is really below most of the noise floor. It uses about I think the spec is 2,500 hertz bandwidth, but it's approximately 3,000 hertz like most other HF signals would be. But the key to it is it's able to really, really distinguish weak signals that are below the noise floor, and that's what really makes it shine. In order to do this, it relies on very precise time synchronization. So what that means is each station that's either sending or receiving FT8 with the software that it uses, it needs to be synchronized in time. And if you're running it on a computer, you need to synchronize the time on your computer so that the other station can be using the same time. And it's got to be within less than a second. The more accurate the time synchronization, the better the decoding can be. And I've actually had some issues over the time that I've used FT8. One time I had it working great one day, and the next day it just wouldn't work at all, and I couldn't figure it out. And it ended up being that I had made a mistake in synchronizing the time on my computer, and I was off by 2 seconds from Greenwich Mean Time. And because of that, my FT8 wouldn't work because all the other stations rely on everybody being on the same time standard. So that's one of the keys to making FT8 work well. I would say, based on what I've read and based on what I've seen, it is the most popular digital mode going on amateur radio outside of CW. FT8 signals can be heard on every band, depending upon the time of day and the propagation, and they're just as reliable as the beacons that we all know that are also on all the bands. FT8 signals are out there in the airspace 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so if you know what standard frequency they're on, you can actually use them as a beacon to help you determine band propagation. And a lot of people use them for that. And once you understand and can hear an FT8 signal, it's a very distinctive signal and easy to recognize. So you can use it in lieu of a beacon. And they're on every band. So what do you require to be able to do FT8 well? You need a radio capable of being connected to some kind of computer, and it's capable of running one of the FT8 compatible computer programs. And we'll talk about some of those. There are a bunch of them out there, but we can kind of talk about probably the most popular ones. So you have to be able to connect that computer to a radio, and then it's got to be able to run, one of the FT8 programs. Typically, FT8 is found on the HF bands, but that's not the only place you can find it. It is able to be transmitted anywhere, and you do find it on UHF and VHF as well, although not as prevalently as on the HF bands. I would say probably the two most popular bands you'll hear it on HF would be 20 meters and 40 meters, although it is on every single HF band. Another area that has been used in the past few years for FT8 is moon bounce. Back in the day, Joe Taylor and Steve Franke and this group developed a mode called JT65, which was very, very popular for moon bounce. But now people are actually using FT8 for moon bounce as well. And FT8 runs a lot faster than JT65, I think, as I know it. I think JT65 takes a minute for each transmission, and FT8 takes 15 seconds per block. So software, most of the FT8 software I have come in contact with runs under Windows and Linux, although there is some software that will run on Apple hardware. I know software that runs on the Mac. I have software that I use for the iPad. And actually, I don't use it, but there's software that'll actually run on the iPhone as well. So it'll run on most platforms, but as I say, if you're going to use the most popular programs, they'll run under Windows or they'll run under Linux. And the most widely used program is one called WSJTX. And then that one was designed by Joe Taylor. That is the JT in the JTX, is for Joe's initials. And that's the most popular one. WSJTX actually does a number of modes, even beyond FT8. It does 8 or 10 different modes. And that would be, if anybody wants to get into FT8, that would be where I would start, was with WSJTX. It's free software, and it's constantly under development. Another popular program is one called JTDX, which is basically an upgraded version of WSJTX, and it's got more features. And I've never used that one. And I've also read that Ham Radio Deluxe, which a lot of people know, that's an entire suite of ham radio software. Ham Radio Deluxe will also run FT8. And then an example of one that runs on Apple products is an application called SDR Control. I run that on the iPad, and it's fantastic. So all of these run FT8, and there may be other programs out there, but those are probably the most popular ones that you'll find. And the most popular is WSJTX. So if you're interested in getting into FT8, that would be where I'd start. And they've got a lot of great documentation that explains it. Another point to make is that FT8 is not a conversational mode. It was not built or intended to be used for conversational exchanges, but rather quick, efficient contacts. And that sort of is a hallmark of it, as it's a super weak signal mode that's, used for digging out signals way below the noise floor. It makes it somewhat difficult to have long conversations. So it's really designed for that. It's used a lot in contesting as well, for that reason, because contesting QSOs are very short exchanges. There is interestingly enough, application that is based on the same 8 frequency keying mode, digital mode that FT8 is, which is called JS8 Call. And that is one that can be used for conversational QSOs, like keyboard-to-keyboard conversations. So it uses the same scheme. It uses the same digital decoding and encoding scheme as FT8, but it's used for keyboard to keyboard, and that's a great deal of fun too. So you can just sit there and type away, and it will send all of your information out in these 15-second blocks of time, and it'll just grind away and send and send and send, and then the other station can send back, and it's great fun. And it uses the same exact sort of format as FT8, and it's able to encode and decode way below the noise floor. So that's fun. But that is made by somebody else. And I forget the name of the gentleman that created the JS8 call app, but related but not the same thing. What else? PSK Reporter. So the PSK Reporter network and the Reverse Beacon network are ways that can provide real-time information on where your FT8 signal is going. This is very useful. So the Reverse Beacon network can be used to determine FT8 signal propagation, which basically means it tells you who is hearing you and what your signal-to-noise ratio is that they're hearing from your station. And there's a few applications. Well, there's some websites, PSK Reporter and the Reverse Beacon network. Information from these networks can be found on the net. They have websites, but there is also a really neat free program called Grid Tracker that kind of does all the hard work for you. And basically, it gives you near real-time feedback. Every time you transmit your FT8 signal, it shows you on a live map where your signal is being heard and what the signal-to-noise ratio is. I find this extremely useful when I'm building antennas or trying to test my rig, or to find out what the propagation is on any given band at any given time, because propagation is always changing. A lot of people don't really understand that about HF, but HF propagation can be up 1 minute and down another. By using this Reverse Beacon network, you can determine within seconds, literally, what the propagation is on a given band and a given frequency. It's very useful for antenna building. And then popularity would probably be the last topic that I would talk about. So there's a great deal of controversy about FT8 and its usefulness. There are some hams that believe that FT8 is not real radio since it involves a computer. And they don't believe that that's proper or a good thing, and they think it's sort of wrecking the hobby, I guess. I don't see it that way. I see it as another tool in the toolbox. I certainly love my sideband, and I'm not a CW guy, but there are days when sideband, the propagation just isn't there on any band due to solar activity or what have you. And on those days, you can still use FT8. And if you want to have a longer conversation, JS8 call. So I think it has a place. But the most useful aspect of FT8 for me has always been the Reverse Beacon network and getting these propagation maps, which help me to understand how my equipment is working, but has also taught me a great deal about how propagation works on any given band on any given day. It makes it really easy and fun to study the art of propagation. And so that's kind of how I would sum up FT8. I believe it's a very useful mode. Maybe it's not for everybody, but it's useful and it's fun to do. And these propagation maps are amazing. It's quite exciting to put out an FT8 signal and then within 5 or 10 seconds instantly watch a map populate in real time, showing me what stations are hearing me all over the world and how strong my signal is. I find that just absolutely fascinating. And all of the software that's used for this is free. And that blows my mind too. So if you have a radio that's capable of being connected to a computer, and even if you don't think you have one that's capable, there are some relatively cheap pieces of equipment like Signal Link, etc., that can be used to connect almost any radio to a computer to do these modes. And it's a great deal of fun. So that's kind of what I have to say about FT8, Steve. Did you have any other questions or things that we would talk about on the subject?
Is there a place, is it in the software, or where do you find the frequencies that people hang out on FT8 on the different bands?
That's a very good point. And thank you for bringing that up. So there are, in the HF bands, well, actually, even in the UHF and the VHF bands, there are somewhat standardized frequencies for FT8. For instance, the 40-meter FT8 standard frequency is 7.074 megahertz. So that's an example of one. And there are basic they're loosely written. They're not really rules or whatever. They may be in the band plan. There's kind of areas where FT8 can be done. There is no, you can set up your software to transmit or receive FT8 pretty much on any frequency you want. But there are somewhat standards, and they're out there. WSJTX has the basic frequencies baked in there. It's already in the software. However, the software is designed in a way that you can add extra frequencies. And one of the things that happens from time to time, there are stations that go out on de-expeditions, as you know. Some of those stations use FT8. What a de-expedition station may do with FT8 is they may create a special frequency that they're going to use over a time frame that they're going to be on their de-expedition that is not on the standard frequency. Because, of course, when a de-expedition goes out and everybody's trying to get DX, they're going to slam the standard FT8 band. So periodically, if there's a contest or something like that, many times a de-expedition or a special event station that's doing FT8 will select a frequency that is not on the standard frequency. And there are a few frequencies for FT8 on various bands. I won't go into the details. That some of them use certain formats for European stations that are looking for U.S. contacts and U.S. contacts that are looking for Europe and all of this type of thing. But there are basic standard, frequencies that's baked into the software. Hopefully that answers your question.
And what about QSL cards? Do people send FT8 QSL cards?
I don't recall ever. I may have gotten one QSL card, but FT8 contacts usually are done en masse. And, when you start out doing FT8, just like anything else in ham radio, you get so excited when you make that very first contact. And then after you do it for a while, especially if you're in the continental U.S. or maybe if you're in Europe, you start worrying less about the contacts near you, right? So with FT8, you have no problems like having QSOs with Africa and Australia and China and Japan and Indonesia. Those things come relatively easily, but contacts in the United States, you can make a contact with any U.S. state at any given time on FT8. And so after you do it for a little while, those become boring, and then you kind of hunger for the DX contacts. So, basically that's where you end up going. And then, after you've done it for a while, you really, when I do contacts, I don't even really bother with U.S. contacts unless maybe it's a contest or something. I'm always looking for that DX contact or the DXDC that I don't have because really those become much more easily reachable with a weak signal mode like FT8 than anything on sideband ever was. And I know people, and that's all they do. All they do is they're making contacts. They don't even, if they've got a DXCC, they don't even waste their time. They're looking only for new countries and DXCC entities. We talked about FT8 basically sends standardized blocks of information, and they're transmitted over a 15-second time period. So when you have a QSO in FT8, usually it's very similar to a DX or a contesting type QSO where the contester calls out CQ, and then another station answers the CQ, and then they exchange signal reports and maybe grid squares, and then the QSO is over. So there's kind of like you go back and forth 3 or 4 times, and then the QSO is complete. FT8 is very similar. The blocks have just enough characters to where you can share your station ID and your grid square, and either that you're calling CQ or you're responding and giving a signal to noise ratio, a signal report back to a station. And then they're acknowledging your signal report to them and giving you a signal report back. And then at the very end, there's sort of like a confirmation that all of the information was received in a 73. So since the blocks take 15 seconds each for each station to transmit its block of information, after 3 or 4 of these, you're done. So it takes between a minute and a minute and a half for a full QSO, which is great. And that's way faster than this older mode, this JT65 mode that we talked about. But there's actually another mode that got invented, and I don't know the exact date, but it was 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, a few years after FT8. they created a new mode called FT4. And FT4 basically takes half the time of FT8 to transmit each block, so 7.5 seconds. And this mode was created as a contesting mode, believe it or not. But it uses a very similar encoding decoding scheme, but it takes half the time. And so that's another interesting one that's out there. And there are also standardized frequencies for FT4 on all the bands. And so you can pretty much carry out an entire QSO in 30 seconds instead of 60 seconds with FT4. So that's interesting. And the WSJTX software, it also will do FT4. So I just thought I'd mention that just for completeness. It is an FT8, but it's very similar to FT8. It just runs at twice the speed. Very interesting mode.
And that will conclude part 1 of our series on FT8. Thanks to Allan KF0FUL for introducing us to this new mode of operating on amateur radio. Next time, we'll talk about the accessibility of FT8 software and equipment and other resources that will help you get the most out of this mode of operating in the hobby.
Have a story or information to submit for the podcast? Send it by email to blindhamnews@gmail.com or call 662-426-6397. That's 662-HAM-NEWS. Thanks for your help.
I'm Steve W0QA, and that's the report this time. I hope you can join me again for another Blind Ham News podcast. 73 and